Our story starts in the suburbs of Baltimore in the late 1950s. A local boy of about 10 named Howard Ashman is putting on a play in his backyard, and he's rounded up some neighborhood kids for the cast. Everyone's having fun until one girl leaves rehearsal to play by herself. Howard won't have that. He takes her aside to let her know she's out of the show. When the girl's mother finds out, she storms over to berate young Howard. The mother tells him he's being selfish. It's just a play for little kids. He's taking it too seriously. But to Howard, nothing is more important than putting on the best show he possibly can. Howard loved to sing and dance and put on a show. And when he couldn't convince other kids to act with him, he'd put them on himself with puppets. Howard's little sister Sarah loved those shows. But his parents weren't sure what to make of their theatrical kid, especially his dad, Ray. Howard's dad was an old-fashioned man's man. When Howard's mother suggested that their son should have dancing lessons,
No. Not a boy doesn't take dancing lessons.
Instead, Ray tried to interest Howard in more manly pursuits, took him fishing. But
He said, Howard, are you having fun? Howard said, no, not really, Dad, are you? He said, frankly, no, let's go home.
that was a bust. Fortunately, Howard had some better ideas. One day, he gathered up a bunch of puppets, sat his dad down, and put on a show for him. It was the story of Peter Pan. It's not hard to see why that appealed to Howard. A boy who lives happily in a world of magic and fantasy, invites people to join him there. Even at that young age, Howard was drawn to stories that seemed to parallel his own feelings. One film that he loved was a movie called Lily. It's about a quiet circus performer who has trouble telling people how he feels, but uses puppets to express himself, just like Howard did. Howard's dad could see how Howard came alive when he was telling stories like these. And he told Howard he'd build him a wooden puppet stage so he could do even more. Howard's dad did his best to financially support the family, though he didn't always have the best jobs. When Howard was young, his dad and uncle worked for a company that was a little predatory. They rented low-quality household items to people who couldn't afford them. After a few years, Howard's dad and uncle quit to start their own competing business. But their old boss was determined to shut them down and accused them of stealing customers and equipment. It wasn't true, but Howard's dad had to go to court. And one day, in the middle of a hearing, the stress overwhelmed him, and he collapsed with a heart attack. The day it happened, Howard and his sister Sarah were at an aunt's house for Seder. Their mother called, crying, to let them know that their dad was sick. Howard and Sarah were to spend the night at their grandparents' house in their mother's old room while she went to the hospital. That night, Sarah was terrified. She couldn't sleep. So Howard did what he could to help. He stayed up with her, singing their mother's favorite lullaby, until Sarah was able to drift off. Their mother joined them later that night, climbing into bed and crying. And after a scary night, the next morning, they learned that Ray would pull through. But their dad never fully recovered and could no longer work full-time. Other family members tried to step in and help raise the kids, but they had trouble understanding Howard too. At one point, Howard's grandfather gave Howard a collection of toy soldiers, boy toys. Howard was delighted. He said they were just what he wanted. But he was careful not to say why he wanted them. Sarah found out a few weeks later when they were cooped up at home during a snowstorm. Howard took her up to his room to show her something secret, and he'd arranged all of the toy soldiers in a tableau that told the story of Peter Pan, hidden under his bed like a secret grotto. Sarah was enchanted, and Howard told her this had to stay their secret. Why was he afraid of people finding out? Well, because when his grandfather gave him the toy soldiers, he also told Howard that he needed to be more manly, that he had to for his father's sake. A lot of pressure to put on a young boy. But when Howard's dad found out about that, he took the grandfather's side and told him to lay off. Howard's parents knew how much theater meant to him, and they enrolled him in a local youth theater. He loved it. He appeared as the lead in Aladdin with his younger sister Sarah playing a genie, and that was fun, but Howard wasn't content to just perform in other people's plays. He started writing his own.
And I used to make musicals out of anything that moved when I was 14 years old.
In many of the shows that young Howard wrote, you can see the seeds of his later work, sometimes literally.
At 17, I wrote a musical, which I called The Candy Shop, about a man who fell in love with a plant that did not eat people, but it had sort of hallucinogenic seeds.
And although the family didn't have a lot of money, his parents would occasionally scrape together enough for vacations. They'd pile into the car and drive up north to New York, singing show tunes the whole way. And as they got closer to the city, they'd see billboards advertising Broadway shows. This was the time of West Side Story, My Fair Lady, The Sound of Music, Oklahoma, Hello Dolly, a golden age for Broadway, with shows that wove music and drama together, a style that would become deeply important to Howard's later work. Through those vacations, Howard got a tantalizing taste of a theater world outside of Baltimore, and he knew that's where he belonged. But he wasn't sure how to get there. For the time being, he kept doing theater programs and writing his own plays in his teens. And then, although no one in the family had ever attended college, he applied to Boston University's School of Arts. It was a prestigious program for aspiring actors. Its alumni included then up-and-comers like Faye Dunaway, Olympia Dukakis, and eventually, Howard hoped, him. He was accepted in 1967 and headed to Boston, searching for a place in theater. At BU, Howard finally found a place he might belong, and quickly decided he hated it. After a year, he ran away to Vermont and became a hippie. He transferred to Goddard, a school with no formal programs, no grades, where students could design their own program and self-evaluate. In later interviews, Howard said it was a huge relief that he didn't have to take any more math classes. At Goddard, Howard flourished as an actor, often in unconventional roles that others might be reluctant to take.
And he got into experimental theater, and it was more offbeat theater. And my mother's story is, at one point he's writhing naked on the floor right in front of her.
At last, he was finding a creative environment where he could thrive. But there was another area of his life where he was less fulfilled. In high school, Howard had dated girls, but while at Goddard, he attended a summer program and met a guy named Stewart, or Snooze, as everyone called him. Stewart was also from Baltimore, but the two of them had never met. Stewart was handsome, flamboyant, passionate, a talented actor, and a terrible singer. Howard's sister Sarah recalled how Stewart channeled his big, broad, charismatic performances in hopes of distracting the audience from his awful pitch. Stewart's type A charm caught Howard's eye. They appeared in a few shows together. At one point, they played brothers in The Lion in Winter.
And by a certain point during the summer, they had become a secret couple.
Together, they started their own theater company to stage their own plays. And they started looking around for grad programs. They applied to Indiana University, and the faculty there were so impressed with the company that they'd started that they offered both Howard and Stewart generous scholarships. So, once again, Howard packed up and moved. This time, wasn't doing it alone.
I remember Howard seeming very happy there. They got to live together, set up a home together.
At Indiana, Howard focused on writing and directing. In his work, you can see a lot of themes that not only interested him as a boy, but that would pop up again in his later shows. He specialized in stories that were intimate, emotional, often with a fantasy twist, and with details that sometimes reflected elements of his own life. His passion project was an adaptation of The Ice Queen, fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. It's about two young friends who were separated and searched the world to find each other. It was a show that became his master's thesis. He even included a singing plant. Howard and Stewart were admired for their work, often with Howard writing, Stewart directing, but this still wasn't a place that they could truly feel like they belonged. In the early 1970s, the Midwest was still a hostile place for queer people. Homosexuality was illegal in Indiana. It was referred to under law as criminal sexual psychopathy. In many towns, it was even illegal to dance with someone of the same sex. Police harassment was rampant. There were a few gay bars dotted around the state, but even those weren't safe. The owner of a gay bar in South Bend had their car stolen and set on fire, and not long afterward, their bar was firebombed. So, despite their creative success in Indiana, Howard and Stewart still didn't fully belong. Like a character in one of his shows, Howard dreamed of somewhere better. And according to his sister Sarah, there was one place on Earth that he had on his mind: New York. He'd never forgotten their vacations, the Broadway shows. To Howard, New York had always felt like Disneyland. Howard and Stewart moved to New York in 1974, and what they found was...
It's filthy.
Well, it's too crowded.
Broken down trains.
Filth. The whole lot is infested with rats.
New York in the 70s was really scary and dirty. It was terrifying.
In the 70s, New York was near bankruptcy. Frequent protests shut down the subway, trash pickups, schools. Police corruption was rampant. Neighborhoods were collapsing, littered with burned-out craters. But New York could also be extremely cheap. And that meant that, for all its problems, it was still a magnet for people from all over the world, especially artists. And following the Stonewall riots in 1969, it was also a magnet for queer people. Howard arrived just as New York experienced an explosion of queer culture. There were annual pride parades, a new push for legal protections. Queer people could openly gather for the first time at coffee houses and bookshops and bathhouses.
Come to man's country and develop your body, or a friendship with somebody else's. Visit us once and you'll come again and again.
There were discos like Studio 54, a frequent hangout of another Baltimorean, Divine. And there was gay theater. The center of all that excitement was Sheridan Square, a tiny little triangular park near the Stonewall Inn. a gathering place in the neighborhood where Howard and Stewart and queer people from all over the world met each other, hung out, and found love, many for the first time. Except, Howard found he wasn't exactly as welcome in New York as he might have hoped. Try as he might to get his plays produced, he kept getting doors slammed in his face. Why was it so hard for him? Well, for one thing,
Howard was not in the coterie of New York theater. His friends, we were his friends from Indiana University, and we were nobodies.
there was a very important group of people who didn't like Howard's work. Producers. The people who raised money, owned the theaters, made the deals. To succeed on Broadway, Howard would need to appeal to them. And he'd arrived in New York at a particularly bad time to do that. Why's that? Well, because in the 1970s, Broadway was moving away from those golden age musicals that Howard had seen on billboards. The new emphasis was exemplified by producer Bernie Jacobs, who told the New York Times, "People like spectacle, there's no question about it." Jacobs was one of the most powerful people in the New York theater scene. His Schubert organization owned over a dozen Broadway theaters. His tastes played a huge role in what opened and what closed. In the 1970s, the emphasis shifted to lavish shows with massive set pieces, like a huge moving train, giant giraffe puppets, production of Dracula with fake bats that flew out over the audience. Not only that, but in the 1970s, Broadway producers wanted more rock music, which was louder and meant performers had to use microphones. And that might seem like a minor change, but it was a shift that caused an uproar. Many found amplified singing to be less intimate, impersonal, that performers could no longer connect with the audience. Another problem? Broadway producers were moving away from shows where songs were integrated into a character-driven plot, and towards what some called the concept musical. That's a loose assembly of songs and scenes that explore an idea. Shows like Hair, Pippin, A Chorus Line by Marvin Hamlish. Even Stephen Sondheim, who rose to fame with narrative shows like West Side Story, was experimenting with looser forms, like Company, a show that uses a series of vignettes to explore the concept of marriage. Howard's work didn't match any of those changes. And try as he might, Howard couldn't get anyone in the New York theater scene to give him the time of day. But there were some places where newcomers were a little more welcome. Broadway was where the big shows were happening. But there was also off-Broadway, a term that generally refers to smaller theaters with more modest performances and lower budgets. And off-Broadway, tiny theaters with fewer than 100 seats. Off-Broadway venues didn't exist to make money. They tended to rely on donations, subscriptions, grants. But in the 1970s, off and off is where a lot of the most daring, exciting, and queer stuff could be found. For example, for just a few bucks, you could see a young drag performer named Harvey Fierstein at La Mama, one of the scrappiest theaters in New York. Building inspectors continually tried to shut La Mama down, but the founder, Ellen Stewart, managed to stay one step ahead of them for years. One night, knowing that inspectors were coming, Ellen ended a play by asking the audience to grab whatever furniture they could carry and follow her down the street to a hideout where they could keep running shows until she got the money together to bring her venue up to code. You could also see an off-Broadway play by Charles Ludlam, who created super gay plays like When Queens Collide and the drag comedy The Mystery of Irma Vep. And you could see shows like The Boys in the Band, about a group of gay men celebrating a birthday. Originally scheduled to run for just 5 nights, audiences loved it, and they ran for over 1,000 performances. Also off-Broadway was a musical called, and this is real, Let My People Come, which included songs with titles like Dirty Words, Everybody Loves to Screw, and this number.
I'm gay.
The story of Let My People Come is unbelievable, and parts of it are so controversial I can't even describe them on YouTube. But I'm posting bonus videos on Patreon with all of the details. You can find that at patreon.com/mattbaum. Howard was struggling to make ends meet, and if he was going to make it as a playwright or a director in New York, it would probably be in off Broadway theaters like those. But there was a problem with that. Those shows seldom made any money, and more often they lost a lot. Finances were tight for Howard and Stewart. They lived in a tiny little studio apartment with a fold-up bed, and they had to find a way to make ends meet. So Howard found a day job at a little publishing company. It paid okay, and there were some highlights of the job, like getting to edit a Disney scrapbook. But it also meant that now his days were taken up by a job that took him away from the theater, the thing that he'd moved to New York to pursue. It was around this time that Howard got some news from home. His father, Ray, had never fully recovered from his heart attack, and over the years his health had declined. And then Howard got the news his dad had passed away. Howard was heartbroken. Ray had always done his best to support Howard, even when he didn't fully understand his artistic son. After his father's passing, Howard wrote a play in tribute. It was called The Confirmation, about a Jewish family in the Baltimore suburbs and a father who's desperate to understand his smart but unpopular child while also struggling to find work and support his family. Howard told a reporter, "I wrote the play for my father," and he organized a small performance at the off-Broadway Sheridan Square Playhouse, with Stewart directing. In rehearsals, there was some hope the show might be good enough to transfer to Broadway, but Howard rejected that idea. "Other people are looking to Broadway, not me," he said. "I don't see Broadway as the big time." To him, what mattered most was a great cast, director, to make it as good as I can. The giant set pieces dominating Broadway needed to rake in hundreds of thousands of dollars to support their spectacles. And Howard could see this intimate personal show had no place there. He said, "I prefer the non-commercial theater. I believe in doing artistic work without commercial pressure." After the Sheridan Square workshop, Confirmation toured to New Jersey and Philadelphia, where the reviews were just okay. Not great. The production ran out of steam and never made it any further. Howard had created a deeply personal show, and it had been rejected. And that wasn't just a professional blow, it hurt. It was like he personally had been told he had no place around a stage. That setback came at a rough time. Finances were already tight, and even worse, he and Stewart were drifting apart. When they arrived in New York, Stewart had dove into the emerging gay social scene. The bars, the discos, the sexual liberation. Stewart wanted an open relationship, and Howard, who was more of a homebody, didn't. And that was turning into a source of friction between them. Howard's personal life was falling apart, his career was stumbling, and after a few years in New York with not much to show for it, he was starting to wonder if he should give up on his dream. But that's when a unique opportunity came along. One of the more obscure off-Broadway theaters was a dingy little dive called the Workshop of the Players' Art, or the WPA, and it was on life support. Those small theaters often operated under the radar, legally speaking, with dubious business licenses and facilities that weren't always exactly up to code. From time to time, building inspectors would swoop in, sometimes during performances, to shut them down, and the city of New York had just told the WPA that if they wanted to keep operating, they'd need to do tens of thousands of dollars worth of renovations. For the people running it, that was too much. Nobody was making any money off the WPA, and they were ready to throw in the towel. But Howard saw an opportunity. He talked it over with a friend named Kyle Rennick, who was the business manager at another theater. He said, what if they took over the WPA and used that to stage their own shows? Sure, the WPA wasn't in the best shape, but it would be easier than going through all the paperwork and expense of starting a company from scratch. They might even be able to hang on to the WPA's list of subscribers, who were one of the main sources of financial support. And they could apply right away for some grants, since the city was trying to rehabilitate the theater scene. It was an interesting idea, and also, possibly, a terrible one. If they did take over the WPA, very little would actually transfer to them, not even the physical theater. They'd only own the company on paper, not the space. It was also financially risky, since the WPA owners had taken on a lot of debt to run their company. Meanwhile, Howard had a regular job in publishing, one that offered stability, and even the occasional chance to work on interesting projects, like editing that scrapbook for the Disney company. There were a lot of reasons to say no to this WPA idea. But there was one more consideration. With Howard and Stewart feeling more distant, Howard thought maybe having a project together could bring them back together.
Howard said to me that the WPA had essentially come about because he wanted to save their relationship.
So, in December of 1976, they pulled the trigger. Howard, Stewart, Kyle, and a handful of friends signed the paperwork. And with that, they owned their own theater. Not the building, just a company. Now they'd have to figure out how to make it work. It was Stewart who found them a new space, a dilapidated floor of a building on Fifth Ave.
Everyone we knew said, don't do it. Lower Fifth Avenue is a ghost town. There's nothing there. It's scary at night.
Below them was a donut shop, and above them, an erotic massage parlor. And they started fixing it up. Kyle ran the business, Howard picked plays, Stewart directed. It was a tiny space, just under 100 seats. But that might work in their favor, especially with Howard's preference for small, intimate shows. They decided to treat the smallness as an asset. At the WPA, the play finds its natural, novella-sized environment, read one flyer. The WPA's mission statement, the development and production of new American plays in the realistic tradition. But in reality, they joked, the WPA really stood for Will Produce Anything. Now, no one was standing in the way of staging whatever they found, whatever they liked, whatever they wrote. And that's just what they did. Starting in 1977, the WPA reopened under new management, and with a real hodgepodge of shows. Stewart directed a small-town drama called The Ballad of the Sad Cafe. They hosted a series of new one-acts. Meanwhile, Howard got busy with a project that had his telltale touch. Misunderstood outsiders longing for more. He adapted an operetta called The Vagabond King, which is about a street rat who poses as the King of France. One of their biggest projects was a musical called Gory Stories, based on the work of Edward Gorey. Gorey had designed the scenery for a huge Broadway production of Dracula, but this show was different. For Gory Stories, the WPA used a minimalist set to focus attention on the characters. And that approach worked. They got the attention of the New York Times, which gave Gory Stories at the WPA a favorable review. That meant the show had good chances of transferring to a commercial theater and actually, making money. So they lined up a new venue at the Booth Theater and prepared for the opening, the night before Halloween of 1978. But there were some problems. At 800 seats, the Booth was a lot bigger than the tiny 98-seat WPA. It had to be bigger in order to sell enough tickets to turn a profit. But the minimalist sets didn't quite fill the space. And then, on opening night in their new space, there was a newspaper strike, and nobody came to review the show. It was the worst possible timing. Without a review, the next night, nobody came to the box office. The show closed after one performance, all told, losing $300,000. It wasn't a great start. And by the end of the WPA's first season, response was mixed. The New York Times theater critic came to one show and wrote admiringly of the WPA's handsome new headquarters. But the critic also said of the show itself, there is only one major thing wrong, the plot, and things weren't much better in Howard's personal life. The strain on his relationship with Stewart wasn't improving. Running a theater wasn't bringing them together like he'd hoped. They'd been through a lot together. College, grad school, moving in together, struggling financially, running a theater company, putting on countless shows. And now, after building a life together for almost a decade, the strain had gotten to be too much. And they decided to split up.
They broke up, and it really affected the family because you kind of had to pick sides, which was like a divorce.
One of the few things working in Howard's favor was a friendship that he'd struck with a composer named Lehman Engel. Engel was a Broadway luminary. He provided Howard with some occasional mentorship, and that was a huge deal because Engel also supervised a group called the BMI Workshop, basically an intensive boot camp for developing new musical theater. BMI students had gone on to create iconic shows like A Chorus Line, Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, Thoroughly Modern Millie, and, more recently, Avenue Q, Book of Mormon, Fun Home. Getting into the BMI Workshop was extremely competitive. Hundreds applied every year, and only a few dozen were admitted. It's where Howard met another struggling musician named Alan Menken. Alan was the son of a dentist, and something of a musical prodigy. As a kid, Alan's piano teacher would assign him Beethoven pieces to memorize, and instead, Alan would simply make up his own Beethoven-ish compositions that were convincing enough. As a young man, Alan's dream was to become a pop musician, and when he brought his material to the BMI Workshop, Lehman Engel sighed, "I wish you people would stop encouraging him to play these fucking pop songs." In hindsight, Menken said, "I didn't know what in the world I was doing." But then he met Howard. The two of them got along, and both took an interest in Lehman Engel's philosophy of integrated musicals. That wasn't a new idea, but it was at the time considered a little old-fashioned. The idea of an integrated musical is that the music, the lyrics, the dance, the drama should all integrate together, blending to tell a story focused on the characters. That was a far cry from the concept musicals that have become more fashionable, and often still are. But it was perfectly in line with the golden age musicals that Howard had seen in his youth, and that he still wanted to create. Howard and Alan decided to collaborate on a show, with Alan writing the music and Howard writing the lyrics. The first project was an adaptation of a Kurt Vonnegut novel called God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. It was ambitious, with a big cast of over a dozen people, a lot for a tiny stage like the WPA's. The novel's about a wealthy capitalist who moves to an impoverished town and tries to solve everyone's problems by giving away money. But he comes to realize money can cause unintended problems, and in the end, he comes to appreciate that money alone can't fix everything, and that kindness, respect are important too. Howard's work often explored the idea that chasing wealth can lead to ruin, and he busied himself turning the chapters into song lyrics. Alan found it easy to work with him, and he called the project a breakthrough that finally got him to give up pop music. Kurt Vonnegut even came to a rehearsal and gave it a thumbs up. Early reviews were favorable. The New York Post called it unpretentious, and that it should find some appropriate off-Broadway venue and settle down for a happy while. That sounded good. Like with Gory Stories, it meant they could transfer to a commercial theater. But that wasn't going to be easy, because the rights to Vonnegut's book were complicated. They needed a production partner to help with the transfer, and that's when they found an unlikely collaborator. Warner Brothers. At the time, a bunch of movie companies were trying to get their foot into other media. Stage shows, television, even video games. At Warner Brothers, an executive named Claire Nichtern was particularly obsessed with corporate synergy.
Showtime synergy.
Claire said, "I want to option the play, sell the movie rights to Warner, the cable television rights to Warner Amex, the music to Warner Brothers Music Publishing, and the games to Atari." That approach is how we wound up getting some truly bonkers movie tie-ins in the early 1980s, like 9 to 5 the video game. Claire thought maybe Rosewater could be the next big thing, but that caused some friction. Warner Brothers wanted to make the show big, moving sets with treadmills, realistic scenery, set it in a giant theater with over 1,000 seats. Howard wanted to keep the show small, intimate, with the audience never too far from the performers. Claire and the Warner Brothers execs hated that.
The producer sent from Warner Brothers, she at one point wanted to fire Howard.
Rosewater transferred from the WPA to an 1,100-seat venue called the Entermedia Theater, and reaction was nearly unanimous. Howard and Ellen's story that had worked great at the tiny WPA was now impossible to connect with in this cavernous space, overwhelmed by spectacles and gimmicks. The show limped along for 6 weeks and wound up losing $400,000.
It was an almost total nightmare.
Howard and Ellen struggled to regroup after that failure. They tried to write some songs on spec for Sesame Street, but they got rejected, although one of their songs was eventually turned into an animated short that's quite charming.
Dear cow, I know you're sensitive. Dear cow, you're beautiful and sweet.
They also tried adapting a Village Voice column into a musical review called Real Life Funnies. A critic from the New York Times came and gave them one of the worst reviews of their lives. Frank Rich wrote that there were next to no laughs. The show was primitive, and the only person having a good time was a stagehand. It was so bad, Allen's manager later recalled, it nearly had them ready to leave musical theater altogether. At that point, Howard and Ellen had two prospects for their next project, to prove that they could make a show that anybody wanted to see. One seemed like a sure crowd pleaser, a show about the life of Babe Ruth. Howard had virtually no personal connection to the material. He didn't hold baseball in high regard. Allen took Howard to a baseball game to show him what it was like, and when Howard learned that the third baseman was named Greg Nettles, he kept referring to him as Greg Nipples. But, on the other hand, Babe Ruth was a famous, popular figure with plenty of mass appeal. The project would be based on a successful book. If you wanted to reach a big, broad audience, this seemed like a promising direction. The other project up for consideration was based on something closer to Howard's heart.
Feed me!
When Howard was around 15 years old, he saw a bizarre movie on TV about a florist shop on Skid Row and a man-eating plant. It had been made in the early 60s by Roger Corman, a notorious B-movie director. Known as the King of Cult, Corman made gory horror films, sexy exploitation flicks, and oddly enough, in the 1980s, he would produce what is still, to this day, the best version of the Fantastic Four.
It's clobbered time!
His 1960 film Little Shop of Horrors had an unusual origin.
The original Little Shop of Horrors began almost as a joke.
Back then, Corman had a friend who had mentioned that he had some movie sets that weren't being used. Corman said he could probably make a movie with them, and the friend asked how long it would take.
I said 2 days. He said, you can't make a film in 2 days. I said, I just want to see if it can be done.
So he quickly threw together a fever dream of a comedy horror. Set on impoverished Skid Row, it's about a flower shop, a down-on-his-luck florist named Seymour who nurtures a strange and unusual plant. The plant brings him fame and fortune, but as it gets bigger, it starts to talk, demanding to be fed blood, and eventually human bodies. Compared to the Babe Ruth project, this seemed about as far from a crowd pleaser as you could get. An obscure, low-budget film with an off-putting topic. Howard and Allen weren't sure which to pursue, the Babe Ruth adaptation or the Little Shop adaptation. Trying to make up his mind, Howard invited some friends over to his apartment to watch the movie and get their thoughts. They all watched together, Howard chain-smoking the whole time, and when it was over,
we just looked at him and said, "You're crazy. This is horrible."
So he tried pitching it to his agent.
She saw the film and told me I was out of my mind and said she liked it, but that I would never be able to get it produced.
Just to see what might be possible. Howard's friend Kyle, who managed the WPA, wrote a letter to Roger Corman. He introduced their company. He asked if the rights were available to adapt the film into, as he put it, an intimate, small-scale chamber musical. Corman wrote back that they weren't the only ones asking. Another group of musical writers, this one based in France, had expressed interest in adapting it as well. But Corman felt that if anyone was going to adapt his movie, it should be an American team, and that he hadn't agreed to anything yet with the French folks. He wrote back to say that if they were really serious, they should talk to his lawyers and draw up a contract. So, they did. Before that other team could swoop in, the WPA scrambled to get the contracts taken care of, and the Babe Ruth project was out, Little Shop was in. Now, they just had to figure out how to write it. Howard had a few guiding principles for the project. After his last few shows had failed due in part to being too big,
I decided that the next thing I did was going to be something attention-grabbing with a cast of not more than 8 people.
He wanted to keep this one as small as possible. But to grab an audience's attention, he wanted to have some kind of gimmick. Not one that was distracting, like treadmills and trains, but one that was part of the story, that integrated into the story alongside all the other characters. And inspiration struck, as it so often does, in the most unlikely of places.
Actually, Miss Piggy was popular at that time. This inanimate thing having this personality that was clear and present and that people responded to and liked.
So he knew he wanted a small cast, a charismatic puppet, and themes that resonated with him from the original film. Humble folks with good hearts, down on their luck, chasing fame and fortune, and sometimes making deals that come with unpleasant conditions. The story had a few personal elements for Alan as well. At one point, they were trying to figure out how the show's first murder would be committed. It had to hit just the right tone between comedic and disturbing. Alan suggested they take the sadistic dentist from the original film, have him take nitrous oxide for fun, and then accidentally asphyxiate. Howard loved that. But what inspired such a bizarre idea?
From, actually, the inspiration of my dear father.
In real life, Alan's dad was a dentist. And not just that.
My dad, growing up, was president of the New York chapter of the American Analgesia Society, a society of dentists that promote the use of nitrous oxide as safe.
Alan felt pretty proud, and he sent his parents a tape of what he was working on. Didn't hear back for a while, and then he got a call.
And goes, my mother. Hi, Alan. It's Mom. We heard the tape. Okay.
They didn't love it, and Alan felt kind of bad, but not too bad because it stayed in the show. But of course, Alan's biggest contribution was the score. Initially, he tried a jazzy sound, more in keeping with the original film, but that just didn't feel right. Then he stumbled across more of a doo-wop sound with musical cues borrowed from Motown and campy 50s monster movies. Classic pop with his own sinister edge. The timing was perfect for a little 50s nostalgia. Just a few years earlier, Grease had been a smash hit off-Broadway. But still, this wasn't a sure bet. When Alan played some of the music to his BMI mentor, Lehman Engel, Engel sighed, well, it's relentless. And figuring out the music was just one challenge. There was also the matter of building a giant man-eating plant that could grow from a tiny prop to a giant monster, singing and dancing and eating entire actors, even extending into the audience by the end of the show. Howard talked to a bunch of puppet builders around New York and kept hearing the same thing. You can't do that. One of the people that he approached was a director named Julie Taymor. She had put on some successful mask and puppet-based shows at La Mama, and many years later she'd become famous for staging Disney's Lion King and Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark. She couldn't help Howard with Little Shop, but she knew someone who could. A guy named Marty Robinson. And while you might not recognize his name, you probably recognize his work.
Hold it! Wait! Oh! Stumpy!
Howard told Marty what they needed, and Marty said, sure, we can do that. He was hired. The only problem was that although Marty felt confident they could do that, he wasn't sure how they'd do it. They didn't have much time to figure it out. Production began in mid-January of 1983, and they needed to be ready for previews by the end of April, just a few weeks. While Marty struggled to figure out the puppets, Howard busied himself with casting. It was a challenging search, especially for the female lead, Audrey. She'd have to be vulnerable and sweet, but also comedic, and able to belt some difficult notes. He quickly found that actors weren't exactly enthusiastic to appear in the show. Many turned it down flat, wondering why the WPA was producing such a ridiculous concept. And that's when they saw an audition by Ellen Greene. Ellen was a former nightclub singer who got her start in the same gay bathhouse as Bette Midler. and she nailed the part of Audrey. Ellen later said that she thought of the character as being a bit like Grover from Sesame Street, larger than life, full of joy, not campy or cartoonish, but with genuine emotion. For Seymour, the nerdy florist, they considered some fascinating actors. Among them, a young actor named Andrew Hill Newman, who'd go on to play the janitor in the Mannequin cinematic universe, and later became the head writer on iCarly. Also auditioning were Lee Wilkoff, an old friend of Alan Menken's. Lee had originally auditioned for a supporting role and came in wearing a wig since he'd been losing his hair since he was a teenager. But Alan just laughed, told him to lose the toupee, and said, "You're a Seymour." In the end, it came down to Lee and one other actor, a young stand-up comedian named Joseph Lane, who had recently changed his name to Nathan Lane. Howard's assistant Connie told him to go with Lee. At the time, it was probably a bummer for Nathan, but it did work out in his favor. After that rejection, he was immediately cast in a series of Broadway roles that made his career, and it worked out pretty well for Lee, too. Not only did he get the part, but he and Howard's assistant Connie became close, and they are still married to this day. As they neared previews, Howard and Alan were still buried in work, and not getting paid much. For writing the show, the WPA could only afford to pay them $350 apiece. Adding to the stress, a lot of their friends were starting to come down with a strange sickness. Some of them had even passed away. The illness didn't have an official name yet, but it seemed to be hitting gay men especially hard. Nobody knew what caused it. At the time, one of the leading theories was it was poppers. It was around this time Howard found out that one of the people feeling unwell was his ex-boyfriend, Stuart. It was one more thing to worry about in what was already a stressful time. For the time being, Howard focused as much attention as he could on the premiere. It was slated for early May, and to play at the B-movie quality, they even scheduled a few midnight performances. The WPA drew up a modest flyer, and Lee Wilkoff, playing Seymour, remembered showing it to some casting agents, and that they laughed him out of their offices, saying, "What the hell is this?" And then, curtain went up on May 6, 1983, with tickets starting at $3. The plot of the musical sticks close to the original film, at least at first. It's set on seedy Skid Row in a dingy florist shop. Seymour is the shop boy, secretly in love with his coworker Audrey, played by Ellen Greene. Seymour and Audrey both have dreams of escaping from Skid Row.
Someone show me a way to get out of here, 'cause I constantly pray I'll get out of here.
But the dreams seem totally unattainable, until an opportunity drops into Seymour's lap. A strange plant that brings crowds to the shop.
Excuse me, I couldn't help noticing that strange and interesting plant.
The plant offers Seymour a deal. It'll bring him fame and fortune, and Audrey, in exchange for feeding it human bodies.
Eat me, Grillborn, eat me now.
An unusual premise for a musical, especially in a theater that boasted the development and production of new American plays in the realistic tradition. But it's not hard to find connections to Howard's own real-life experiences in trying to find his place on stage. Struggling with no money, with a love that in many settings he had to keep hidden, finding that his talent might provide a pathway to success, but that success could come with pressure to produce something that gets big and crowd-pleasing, something he loses control over, something that demands more from him as time goes on. Little Shop explores the price that one has to pay for fame and fortune. And as strange and dark as the show was, it got rave reviews. Critics were delighted to find a gem in this little rundown theater. And those casting agents who had laughed Lee Wilkoff out of their office, now they kept calling, not just asking him for tickets, but begging for them. As with Howard's other shows, that positive attention came with offers to transfer from the little WPA to a big commercial theater. Howard had been through this process a couple of times now, and he knew the kind of trade-offs that meant. Trade-offs that had doomed shows in the past. A transfer would require producers, and they could demand more control, and potentially fire Howard. But then again, if it did succeed, Howard and Alan's contract had a provision for them to get a portion of the proceeds, a lot more than the $350 they were initially paid. And it could lead to more opportunities. In particular, Howard was eager to work on a follow-up project, a musical about a woman named Joan who disguises herself as a man and winds up being elected pope. More money and the exposure could open a lot of doors for more dream projects. Then came a call from a familiar name. Bernie Jacobs, head of the Shubert Organization. The producer who just a few years earlier told the New York Times that Broadway was all about spectacle now. Bernie had seen Little Shop early in the run. His opinion?
It stinks.
But he'd heard from a rival producer that Little Shop would never make money. And kind of like Roger Corman making the original film, Bernie couldn't resist a dare. He called the WPA and asked them to name their price. They weren't quite ready to say yes. Bernie had a reputation for being hard to work with. Another producer once called him the worst migraine you've ever had in your life. Plus, the Shubert organization had little experience with off- and off-Broadway shows. Their specialties were giant productions like Evita, Jesus Christ Superstar, Dreamgirls, and their latest, just a few months away from opening, Cats. To negotiate with Bernie, the WPA sent over the best business guy they knew, their general manager, Albert Poland. Albert had been in showbiz a long time, starting as the founder of the official Judy Garland fan club in 1955. And he'd been working as a producer off-Broadway for so long he'd written the book on it. Literally, there's his name on the cover of the book. Albert walked into Bernie's office with a few requirements for the show, mostly about budgets, billing, but also a firm condition from Howard.
Howard was very clear when we did Little Shop of Horrors that it had to stay off Broadway.
Bernie sure did drive a hard bargain, but Albert did too. And by the end of their meeting, they'd hammered out an agreement in the hundreds of thousands of dollars that not only blew all the other offers out of the water, but allowed Howard to keep control and keep the show in a small off-Broadway venue. As they were wrapping up their exhaustive session, Bernie asked Albert, "By the way, how do you get your hair to stand up like that?" To which Albert said, "Actually, when I got on the elevator to see you, it was lying down." Little Shop ended its WPA run over the summer and prepared for a transfer to the Orpheum. They'd need to make some changes. The Orpheum was a bit bigger than the WPA, a little over 300 seats, but the WPA folks did an extensive renovation to keep the feeling intimate, and even added a balcony that brought the audience closer to the stage than the back of the room. A bigger theater meant they'd need more crew, and the behind-the-scenes family grew a bit larger during this time. Among the people who joined them was a company manager named Peter Schneider, who'd mostly been working in nonprofit theater until this point. And although nobody knew it at this time, he'd totally transform Howard's life just a few years later. For the time being, Howard remained intimately involved with every aspect of production. If anything needed doing, he was ready to step in. Like on opening night, a chair was supposed to slide out on stage and the mechanism didn't work, so Howard just strode out and set it down himself. He was in his element. From the puppet shows he'd put on as a kid, to the college productions he'd staged with Stewart, to the plays that he wrote and directed the WPA, Howard was seeing all of his years of work culminating in this production. To help get the word out, the company put together some TV ads.
It's bone-chilling. It's spine-tingling. It's a musical.
Those quickly developed a cult following, the ads almost as popular as the show. Not that they needed much publicity.
I thought it was really amazing.
Beautiful. Kinky.
I liked it a whole lot.
Little Shop of Horrors is the greatest play in the universe.
It's better than Gremlins, better than E.T.
At the Orpheum, critics specifically called out the intimacy that Howard had fought for as one key to the show's success. One critic called it the next step in the musical's evolutionary progress to the small, inexpensive shows providing more modest pleasures than the glittering musicals of the past. Another wrote, "Broadway's off, but off-Broadway shines." Before long, Little Shop was selling out every night, operating a net weekly profit of around $7,000, which was considered a runaway success. If they'd gone to a bigger theater, they could have made more money, but the WPA's Kyle Rennick said, even though there's much more money to be made, Little Shop is fundamentally an off-Broadway musical. In particular, the puppet became something of a celebrity. Audrey II was a guest of honor at sci-fi conventions, at flower shows. She even stopped by Good Morning America. And there was nearly a disaster when Good Morning America misplaced her for a few hours. When they finally found the plant puppet close to curtain time, they had to take her in a frantic drive across town, a huge tentacled plant in a station wagon swerving through midtown traffic. And on many nights, Audrey II wasn't the only celebrity in the theater. Little Shop drew big names in the audience. On any night, you could look around and maybe see Eddie Murphy, Mary Tyler Moore, Barbara Streisand, Sidney Poitier, Bette Midler. Lucille Ball showed up one night and loved the show so much she went backstage and took photos inside the plant. And she told Howard she wanted to work with him on a musical adaptation of one of her films. Meanwhile, plans were underway for a West Coast production and international translations. There were talks about a film adaptation. What started as a tiny little show was turning into a big moneymaker for a lot of people, and many of them wanted more. That included Bernie Jacobs, head of the Shubert organization. He called Little Shop's general manager, Albert Poland, back into his office, along with the other Little Shop producers. Bernie announced that Cats was making nearly $200,000 a week on Broadway, and he wanted